Hi, I'm Creed with Homebuyers University. This is course number 2, and we're going to be talking a lot about hiring your broker today. In class number 1, which is up on your screen right now, we had talked about the definitions of working relationships when you do hire a broker, or anytime you actually work with a broker. They can represent someone else, and one of these 4 definitions would still fit you. And we're just going to touch very quickly. If you did not watch that particular course, do watch it. As we talk about the hiring of a broker in this course, and then later when we talk about actually submitting offers to purchase properties, this will come up over and over and over. This is something you really need to understand. It's not super complicated, but it does get a little bit tricky. So, just going to touch on this very quick. The actual definitions of working relationships, and we're going to use the same basic definitions as we did in the first course. Obviously, the seller's agent has a written agreement to represent the seller. Buyer's agent, and that's what we're going to talk about today, has a written agreement, and that agreement is what we're going to talk about with you, the home buyer, to represent you, and that can change. That's where it gets tricky. You can start off as having a buyer's broker, buyer's agent, and we spoke last time, those two terms are pretty much interchangeable. But it can get tricky, and we're going to touch on that a second time in this course. Transaction broker, we're going to go with that attorney's definition that I've had from some years back, and that's where buyer agent represents buyer, seller agent, seller. Transaction broker kind of represents the transaction. They don't advocate for either party, but they do everything they can to hold the deal together, put it together and keep it together. And then fourthly, the being a customer means you have no relationship. They can't lie, cheat, or steal, but the broker can't, or the seller in your case. I don't know. The seller, I'll be honest with you, if you're doing directly with a for sale by owner, they certainly may not live to the same standards as a real estate broker would. But a customer has no representation, no legal representation in the deal. And that's the last we're going to touch on this. We're going to close this out. We talked about this one for a moment in the last course, the first course. And if you didn't see that, please do take a look. This is the kind of form you're going to see if you go in and do try to make an offer on a property solely represented by a broker for the seller or a for sale by owner. They probably won't give you this form, but it gives you a general idea of what's going to happen and what your representation is. We're going to close this. Again, if you didn't see course 1, do look. Today we are going to talk about this particular contract, the exclusive right to buy listing contract. I don't like the title, but I'll get over that. I've been at this a really long time. As with all contracts, I want you to take the first peek up top. This has been approved by the Colorado Real Estate Commission. We covered this pretty deep in course number 1. Make sure you watch that. They do want to remind you right up front, this is the Colorado Real Estate Commission reminding you, this is a binding contract, has legal consequences, and you should consult legal and tax or other counsel before signing. Other counsel may not be your mom, so be careful whose advice you're taking on this. Compensation charged by brokerage firms is not set by law. What that means, there is no standard fee that a broker is able to earn. It's completely open, and it's actually completely negotiable between you and your broker because you're mostly responsible for that, and we'll talk about that as we go through this. Or the seller or the seller's agent if they choose to get paid through that method. But just kind of keep that in mind. Right away, you have 2 boxes you could check or not check. Buyer agency, transaction broker. Again, course number 1 is really important. We're going to assume that you checked buyer agency on this one. And then we'll go through some of the potential complications or outcomes that may come from that. Brokerage firm will receive compensation as set forth in this buyer listing contract. You're going to define how they're going to get paid. So you really want to learn something about this agreement, because it may be you that's writing that big check for their commission. And we're going to scroll down a little bit. This is just defining you and the broker, whoever it is that you may be hiring. There is a difference. The brokerage firm, of course, is the entity, the corporate entity that the broker, the agent that you'll be working with, is affiliated with. The next thing on the contract we're going to come across is the, quote, listing period. I kind of find that term a little bit detestable, listing. It comes back from when the brokers had complete control of the real estate industry, and the only way anyone could get information was through the MLS, Multiple Listing Service, and only brokers had that ability. Pretty much all of the properties are up on the internet now, and so to just say that you're putting somebody's property or somebody on a list, it's pretty incorrect. And anyway, I'll stop my soapbox on that one. This is the period of time that you're hiring your broker. So you're going to say starting today, whatever the date is, and for the next 60, 90, 120 days, whatever it might be, you're going to put that in here. And as long as you and the broker are both living up to the covenants within this contract that we're talking about, this just continues up until the point of you finally purchase a home and close on it. Now, if for any reason you're unable to accomplish that, in other words, let's say you signed up for 90 days and you and the broker getting along fine and like each other and working hard together, but you just haven't quite found that property, what you would end up doing, and we'll pop open a different contract real quickly, is you would just extend that time period. And this is just an addendum that attaches to this original agreement that we're going to go in depth on. And this just extends out, and as always, let's stop and look. Colorado Real Estate Commission approved, and you should talk to attorneys and tax advisors if you're concerned about anything. And it's going to say, you know what, we had this current contract going, and again, we're going to define who the brokerage is and who you are. And we're just going to simply state that we're going to extend this to a certain date. And at that point, if there's something additional you want to put in there, you can. Everything else in the contract remains the same. And that's as simple as that. And we're going to close this now, go back to our original contract right here. And that's it. That's your listing period, or the period of this agreement. If anything on this contract has the abbreviation NA, as in non-applicable, or the word deleted, it means it's no longer a part of this contract. Just be aware that exists in this agreement, and that actually exists in most of the Colorado real estate contracts you're going to see as you progress through this whole system. So just kind of keep an eye on that. That becomes important because you're removing or negating something within the agreement if that's in there. We talk a little bit about in-company transactions. Now, this is where things get a little bit complicated. In the first course, we talked about this a bit when you stopped by an open house and considered having the seller's agent write up an offer for you. This is related and similar to that, but the first paragraph here is most brokerages, the companies, are going to have more than one broker. They can have only one, but most are going to have more than one. So if there are two different brokers within the brokerage, and one represents the seller and one represents you, the buyer, okay, with different brokerage firm, those brokers continue to conduct themselves with the brokerage relationships they have established. What that means is, just because your agent, Jane, is representing you as a buyer for XYZ brokerage, and Joe represents the seller of the home you want to purchase, and he also has his license at XYZ brokerage, nothing is going to change. You still have your full agreement. That seller still has their full agreement. Okay, does that one make sense? Let's move on. So next on the contract where you've hired your broker, we're going to complicate things a little bit. And I'm not doing this on purpose, but these things happen in real life. And the reason they're built into your contract is so you can predefine how things are going to be handled. It's already stressful enough trying to decide on a house and what to do in terms and moving and all this stuff. This is going to reduce some of that stress so that you don't have to deal with that at the exact same time. So in our first scenario, the buyer and seller, you and the seller, each had different brokers for the same company. This next scenario is how we're going to handle it if it's your broker that's handling the same deal for the seller and you want to buy that house. So this gets a little bit complicated. Let's just take this step by step so I don't lose you. Buyer agency unless brokerage relationship with both. When would it be possible that your broker, your agent, who you have a buyer's agency contract signed with, this contract, would be able to treat the seller as just a customer in the transaction? For sale by owner. There, if the seller were to agree, your broker could fully represent you and treat the seller as just a customer. What does that mean? Remember course one? Your broker can't lie, cheat, or steal, but the seller has no advocate, nobody fighting for them on their side, whereas you still do, okay? But now let's say that your broker that you've spent 60 days with, and you guys are getting along pretty well, you like each other, you tell them all kinds of stuff, if we make an offer on some house and we'll come in at this price, and if it doesn't work out and they counter, we would accept that. We just, we won't tell them that until we make them work for it a little bit, and so on and so forth. You're giving them some inside scoop. So they go into the deal knowing I'm going to try this, but if this doesn't work and they come back even at this, I know that you still want the property, but I'll try to get something in between nonetheless, right? Unless there's other buyers complicating the whole scenario. You're used to talking like that because you have a buyer's agent. But let's say this buyer agent is also the listing agent for a seller that they fully represent. You have a buyer agency, the seller has an agency. You want your buyer agent to present an offer on his or her listing, and he represents the sellers also. It gets really complicated. If magically, remember at the top, and we'll come back down. Remember at the top of our contract, we could have chosen buyer agency or transaction broker, and we chose buyer. If magically you had chosen a transaction broker and the seller had chosen transaction broker, then when we come back down here, sorry, this is just real life stuff. Magically then, you continue exactly as you would have. Your agent, which was a transaction broker, and the seller's agent, which was a transaction broker, which means what? Remember when we talked about all of this in course one? They represent kind of the transaction or the deal. They don't fully represent buyer or seller, right? So this would continue and you would be absolutely fine with no change. But more than likely, you signed up for a buyer agency. The seller more than likely signed up for seller agency. So what's going to happen is if you really want this home, the agent is going to request from both you and the seller separately to change your status from buyer agency to transaction broker. Going to ask the seller to change from seller agency to transaction broker. And he might even, or she might even, put in additional provisions. Hey, this is, what we're agreeing to, and I will keep everything top secret between each of you guys, because they've been talking to the seller the same way they've been talking to you about, what are you willing to do? What do you want to do? How do you want to do it? And now you don't necessarily want to be giving them that kind of detail in your information. And let's look really quick. This is if they want you to change to a transaction broker. They're going to whip out this handy dandy form. And again, as always, approved by Colorado Real Estate Commission, change of status to transaction broker. Okay. And essentially, they're going to pull this out when it's time to go from a buyer agency to a transaction broker relationship. And that's it. That's the whole scoop. Now, it could be just for this one property, and that's fine. And you can do that. And if you're comfortable with that scenario, you can do it. But that's something you'll have to decide. That's why you're learning about this ahead of time, because you don't want to have to deal with all these decisions and thought processes right in the middle of wanting to make an offer on a property. Oh, you don't need that additional stress. They're going to attach this to the original exclusive right to buy agreement you had and let you know once again that they are going to be a transaction broker between the buyer and seller on this property, and they are no longer an advocate for either party. Do you remember I've mentioned a couple times in the courses how you can have full representation and then all of a sudden at some point you can lose it? This just happened. Okay, that was what I was talking about. They were your comrade, your confidant, your advocate. They were your buyer agent, and now they're not. And so you just need to make that mental adjustment and understand you tell them what you want to happen, but you're no longer giving them all those inside secrets of, you know what, I would pay another 25 grand over the asking price to get this home. You don't want to be saying those sort of things. It's becoming very business and legal type stuff. You're just giving them instructions. Does that make sense? And now we're going to close out this form, and we're going to wrap up as quickly as we can. So we've battled through all this stuff. The form continues here just to give you an idea of what they do regardless of your agency agreement, and that's what's in here. I'm not going to beat you to death on this stuff, but it says they need to do these things, and it says they won't do these things, which is a few of the secrets you don't want the other party you're negotiating with to know. And that happens whether it's buyer agency or transaction broker, but you still want to use some caution on what you say if you change over to transaction broker. Broker has no duty to conduct an independent inspection. When you buy a home, there's a ton of steps, and you're going to search for homes. You're going to get qualified with a lender unless you have cash. Once you go under contract, you're going to have an inspection. You're going to have an appraisal, and all these things are going to happen. The broker's there to assist you and advise you, but the days of agents telling you, hey, here's the lender you need to use, are well over. That's completely against the regulations, and just anticipate getting some advice from the broker on those sort of things, but you making a final decision and you instigating the agent, or I'm sorry, the inspector to go out and so on. You don't let the broker do that, because you want to make sure that the person that is protecting you in this deal, an inspector's there to protect you, knows what they're doing. Don't take anybody's advice. You make that final decision, okay? We're going to run down here. Now, if they are a buyer's agent, they have a few additional duties. Promoting your interests exactly as you most desire. Good faith, loyalty, fidelity. Seeking price and terms. And again, hey, try this, but if it doesn't work, we're willing to do this, so on and so forth. Those sort of things. Good with buyer agents. Maybe not so good with transaction broker, okay? And then counseling you as far as the risks of a transaction that are known by the broker. And that could be almost anything. They know that this neighborhood's having these kind of problems, or these sort of homes built at these time frames could have these sort of problems. They shouldn't be giving engineering advice. They shouldn't be giving inspection advice. But you know what? You kick around these neighborhoods long enough, you start to pick up a few things. They can say, you know what? Make sure the inspector looks for this on this particular home. Make sense? Compensation. This is a big one. And then we're going to finally get through this contract. Compensation to brokerage firm. All the payments actually go to the brokerage company, the legal entity, and then the funds, the commissions, whatever is agreed with between your broker and the brokerage trickle back down to them. Success fee, what does that mean? That means you found a home, you lived through all of the contingencies, and you got this thing to closing, and you showed up and signed at closing, and you got some keys and you moved in. They got paid right then and there. The amount is often a percentage, and this has been a deal with the Department of Justice for decades regarding MLSs and the National Association of Realtors and all kinds of stuff, because very often the figure shows up to buyer agents of 2.8%, and the DOJ said that looks kind of suspicious that every buyer's agent is worth that, regardless if it's a $100,000 house or a $10 million house. Anyway, that would be defined here. Be careful here, but no less. So maybe they say, well, I'll take 1%, but no less than $500,000. So that would supersede this. Just be cautious of what goes in these blanks, because you are responsible for these things. If a transaction does not close because of the seller, no fault on you, the buyer, the success fee will be waived. Okay? But if you cause it not to close, let's say you find the home, you live through all the contingencies, it's the day of closing, loan's approved, everything's good to go, and you decide not to show up, you are responsible to that broker for their commission on that particular transaction as defined within this contract. There are a few other ways it can be paid. Hourly fee, I very seldom see that, but be aware it's available. They may ask for a retainer fee. Hey, we're good friends, but why don't you give me $5,000 to make sure we stay good friends, okay? Or whatever compensation, that you may arrange. 95% on residential real estate plus is probably in this success fee type situation. Just be aware of that, okay? Now, here's the important part. Paragraph 7.3. Who is going to pay this? Listing brokerage firm or seller may pay. So you had the seller and their agent, and they put in the multiple listing service, MLS, some percentage of a fee or a flat fee that they will pay. When your agent, your broker, sees that's an agreement. It's an agreement you don't see, but it's an agreement between agents, brokerages, MLS systems, so on and so forth, okay? If they're not happy with it, let's say that you put in there 2.5% as a success fee, and somebody offers 2% or some flat fee of $7,500, whatever it might be, this is the time to find out if your broker is going to be unhappy about it or if they're willing to adjust their compensation based on that. Otherwise, if you put 2.5% and it's a $1 million home and they're expecting a huge paycheck and somebody else only wants to pay 2%, and this is obligating you to make up the difference. Does that make sense? It's a big check. It's a lot of money. So you're defining this up front. If there's something in that MLS information that your broker's not going to be happy with on payment and you buy that home, you want to work something out right then and there. You do not want to wait till the day of closing and say, oh man, yeah, you owe another $15,000 in commission on top of that. You don't want that. Okay, so if you back out, if seller backs out, you're not going to owe. If you back out and all the contingencies have been met, you're likely going to owe. I can't say it for sure. That's a legal matter. We don't discuss legal stuff here, but be aware, okay? They can also have the buyer pay. On occasion, a buyer says, you know what, I'm going to pay you 10 grand and I want you to negate whatever they're offering you out of the MLS, and that goes toward the price that I'm paying on the home. So if they were going to pay a $10,000 commission, then you would explain that in your offer. Hey, you are not paying my agent, I am. Don't have that money you're going to be paying out as part of our agreement. Reduce your expenses by that amount. I want you to be aware of that. Make sure that's in the additional provisions. And we're nowhere close to making an offer yet. Okay. Listing brokerage firm or seller may pay, which is typically what happens. Okay. And if they check this box for you, wonderful. Because it says if the listing brokerage firm or seller does not pay, then you're not obligated. Now, they're fully expecting, like 99.99% sure, that one of these two guys is going to pay them through the MLS agreements, okay? But if for some reason it doesn't happen, this is getting you off the hook. And that's the only checkbox that's going to get you off that hook. Does that make sense? And you are not obligated to pay it under any conditions. Buyer agrees to conduct all negotiations for the property through broker. When you do this agreement, you don't want to run around. You can search on the internet all you want. Send your broker some addresses, say set up these showings, okay? But don't run off in the middle of a Sunday afternoon and bang on for some for sale by owner's door and say, how much? And they say X. And you go, ooh, that's like 4 or 5% below market value, I think. Let's make a deal. Don't do it. Let your broker do it. That's what you're agreeing to in here. Okay, does that make sense? And that's just one explanation of how that could happen, but that's maybe the most common possible one. Costs of services or products, and we touched on this before. Don't expect your broker to put up any money for inspections, for appraisals, and for surveys or anything like that. Loan fees, so on and so forth. These are expenses you're going to be paying. And you don't want your agent doing the hiring of this stuff. You want to be in control of this stuff. That's why you're taking these courses, so you're knowledgeable. You can ask them for advice, for a list of people that they would recommend. But in the end, you're going to make the decision, and in the end, you're going to pay for these things. And you can always ask everybody for an expense estimate right up front, okay? Additional tasks you may ask the broker to do. This may be anything specific that you're concerned about, but let's say you're buying a property in a new subdivision, and you want to make sure that broker checks that land behind your house is going to stay as open space and not have a 42-story condos high-rise behind you. You can put that sort of thing in here, and most anything else. Anything can go in a contract as long as it's not illegal, honestly, is what that comes to. That's not legal advice. We don't do legal advice here, but you know what I'm saying. Okay, and again, you should ask everybody for an estimate of their costs, any of these people, anyone. And don't do it if you don't approve the costs and you don't like the person doing whatever the task is you're hiring them for. And we're almost out of here. Wait till we get to the sales contract. It's like 5-8 times longer than this. Wire and other frauds. Oh my gosh. The criminals have figured out so many things. It used to be where we could almost like just send an email, and it would probably come from the title company to both you and your broker, and it would say, wire the funds, here's our routing number and account number. And there has been so much money sent to the wrong place, to the point where the criminals figured out how to create fake email accounts, and they would email you. and say, oh, at the last minute, that $42,000 that you need for closing, we're not going to send it to that account. We're going to send it here because that one's closed for auditing or some BS, right? And you would send your money and it ends up in some foreign location and you never see it again. And that's the end of your home purchase. Almost all of the transaction data for wiring funds at this point is done in person. I know we had to take a big step back. We thought we had all this stuff, for convenience electronically. When it gets down to the final dollar, listen to nobody but the title company, which is more than likely who's going to be arranging your final closing, and follow their instructions. And if you get some email or even a random phone call, don't trust it. Call the phone number of the contact you have been working with and talk to them only. It's gotten that ugly. I'm sorry, but it just has. Again, the Colorado Real Estate Commission would like to invite you to pull in some attorneys or tax counsel if you have any concerns about anything on here. Additional provisions, almost anything can go in here. If you have a particular concern, your broker can do anything for you that's not illegal, okay? And you're just about, there. One last thing, entire agreement. And I've brought this up a couple times in the courses. They keep mentioning, per the written or oral agreement, and it freaks me out when they put that oral thing in the contract. So let's read this together. And just keep this rule for any document and anything you want accomplished buying your home. Entire agreement. This agreement, this written agreement, constitutes the entire contract between parties, and any prior agreements, whether oral or written, have been merged and integrated into this listing contract. If it was out there on another piece of paper, if it was out there verbally and it's not in here, it's not part of the agreement. And just keep that rule in mind for everything you do in real estate. And that's it. You guys would sign off on this probably electronically, and you would have just hired yourself a broker. Hey, I forgot one thing, and this is an important thing. It's really important. And I had it open and just forgot about it. When we were talking about any of the let's call them contractors, subcontractors, parties involved in providing any sort of services relating to the purchase and closing of your home. That's everybody. That's lenders, title companies, appraisers, inspectors, surveyors, you name it. Anybody that walks in the door that does a repair before the closing, so on and so forth. Okay. When you're signing this agreement with your broker, and you just live through the whole big explanation on what that's committing you to, this happens, it can happen for small brokerages, but it often happens for the larger nationally based brokerages. The Colorado Real Estate Commission and some federal government entities that oversee these sort of things, they've really come down pretty hard on brokers and brokerages when they recommend a service or a provider. They should do nothing more than give you a list. If you say, I need an inspector, well, here's 4 that I found that have a good reputation. They shouldn't say, here's the guy. Okay. Let's open up a form here. And this is not so much a specific form. This came up from the Colorado Real Estate Commission site, Department of Regulatory Agencies. Thing I told you didn't have to remember. It's linked at the website. Don't worry. This came up, and it could look completely different than this. But what they want you to do is, if your broker or your brokerage or the franchise the broker works with has what's called an affiliated business arrangement. What that means is somehow they either own or get some sort of profit from that inspector. They either own or get some kind of profit from that title company. They either own or get some sort of profit from that lender that they are recommending, they should absolutely disclose that to you. Absolutely. There have been multi-million-dollar lawsuits, federal government against franchises and brokerages, and I don't see the brokerages winning. So, yeah. And it may not look exactly like this, but if you're really sharp and you want to deal with it, if they give you a list of references, say, hey, by the way, is anybody on this list part of a affiliated business arrangement between you, your brokerages, your brokerage, or the franchise? And if they look a little pale, dig deeper. Because if there is any relationship, if they have any way of making some sort of profit from somebody or something they refer to you, they have to tell you up front. And you do not have to use them. You can use anybody you want. And let's wrap up there. Thanks. Thanks for sticking through course number 2. And we'll see you in course number 3.